James Dean, the Hollywood legend who lived fast and died young. His love of fast cars drove him from the silver screen to the racetrack.
People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day than on a highway.
Jimmy was fast at any cost. That particular car was a deadly automobile.
At the age of 24, with a glittering career before him, he died in a horrific car crash.
Tried to feel a pulse, couldn't feel a pulse.
But 50 years later, his untimely death has remained shrouded in mystery. Until now. This program has pieced together events that led up to the accident. Using cutting-edge crash investigation technology and evidence gathered at the time, we will uncover the truth about how James Dean died. A rebel actor with a passion for speed, Dean's moody good looks propelled him to stardom.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Dean.
In his brief career, he made just 3 films. But his sudden violent death made him a legend.
He's the American symbol. He represents our culture.
He was one of the new wave of anti-heroes whose rebellious disregard for authority defined the youth of post-war America. Away from acting, Dean's other passion was for cars and racing.
We asked Jimmy over today because he's a racing man himself. A real one, not a crazy one.
He loved the machines, and he had a talent for speed. He drove a lot faster than I tended to or wanted to drive.
He loved racing. I mean, that was his life. Speed. He liked speed.
Afraid he was taking too many risks, his Hollywood bosses tried to ban him from racing.
I can remember him putting his motorcycle in our garage because obviously they didn't want him riding it. The studio didn't want him riding it at the time.
Hollywood tended to want to fit him into a mold, and he wasn't going to fit into any mold. He wasn't going to be part of it. He wasn't going to play that game.
The film studio had reason to worry. California's racetracks were all makeshift, set up on public roads with only hay bales for crash barriers.
It was very dangerous racing on the streets with no protection. And guys were, stacking up their cars.
Joe Playan competed against Dean on the Californian race circuits.
We ran with 4.5-inch wide tires. The brakes were lousy. Unfortunately, we managed to kill a guy or two every race.
You've won a few races, haven't you?
Oh, 1 or 2.
I'd like your opinion about fast driving on the highway. Do you think it's a good idea?
A good point. I used to fly around quite a bit, I took a lot of unnecessary chances on the highways. And I started racing, and now I drive on the highways. I'm extra cautious.
One more question. Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine.
Just weeks after recording this road safety film, Dean and his mechanic headed out into the Californian countryside in his brand new Porsche Spyder. He planned to race it the next day. But his journey was cut short by a Ford coupe driven by 23-year-old Donald Turnipseed.
It was very shocking to see those two cars hit.
Don Dooley is the only surviving witness of the crash. He has never spoken on camera before about what he saw. Dooley, then 15, was traveling with his brother-in-law. They narrowly avoided the collision.
We were about 50 yards behind Donald Turnipseed. We had to do some pretty heavy braking to stop from being in the accident ourselves. Pieces went flying. The headlight ring on the Porsche went sailing over our pickup. The Porsche went airborne. James Dean, he was pawing at the air to try to keep inside of the car.
Dooley ran to the scene of the crash to find a second man, still conscious, lying next to the car.
I think he was lifting his head up and trying to say, where's Jimmy? But I don't know if he bit his tongue half off or what, but his mouth was all full of blood. And he was saying, oi, Jimmy, you know. And I didn't know who he was talking about.
Dean remained trapped inside the car.
I went around to James Dean, and I felt of his pulse. I couldn't feel anything.
On the way to the hospital, the young actor died of massive internal bleeding and a broken neck. With the death of Jimmy Dean, the actor, came the birth of James Dean, the legend. Within hours, questions arose about the circumstances of the crash. 50 years on, many of the questions remain unanswered. Was Dean's reckless driving responsible for the crash that killed him?
You spin the wheel so many times, you know, you run across a freeway so many times, and you're going to get hit. It's going to happen.
How did Dean react in the split second before impact?
Dean tried to avoid him but couldn't get around him.
And most incredibly, was James Dean himself actually behind the wheel? The only surviving witness believes not.
James Dean was sitting on the left side facing us, which would be the passenger side. The man wearing the plaid shirt was behind the steering wheel, and that was the mechanic.
At the inquest into the actor's death, Don Dooley's claim was never verified. Top crash investigator Mike Kennedy has re-examined the evidence and conducted a new investigation into the collision.
In 1955, the police on-scene investigators did things entirely differently and not as scientifically as people do them now.
Forensic techniques available today will shed dramatic new light on the accident. This fresh investigation will reveal exactly what happened 50 years ago, on the day that James Dean died.
How fast will your car go?
Oh, in honest miles an hour, clocked, it run about 106, 7.
Clues to James Dean's death and his passion for speed can be traced back to his youth. He grew up on his uncle and aunt's farm just outside Fairmont in rural Indiana. But the first vehicle he learned to drive was a far cry from the aerodynamic Spider.
Dad had him driving a tractor at a young age. About all farm kids learn to drive on tractors, and so he just naturally moved from a tractor up to a motorcycle. He liked to ride it just fast as they'd go, which was probably only 50 miles an hour, and his feet sticking straight out the back.
Former highway officer Jim Grindle was a close friend during his school years.
This is the old high school where we graduated. Jim and I and the rest of our class graduated in 1949. It just brings back a lot of memories as I'm sitting here.
Lunch breaks were spent close by at Marvin Carter's motorcycle shop.
It's really kind of a candy shop, so to speak. You just come out here and drool. That was every boy's dream, to have a motorcycle. I think what he loved mostly about them was the freedom that it represented. You climb on that bike and you just feel free.
By the time he was an aspiring young actor in Los Angeles, this love of freedom was evolving into something far more dangerous.
He had a little thing he would like to do, which was to have the bikes running side by side, and he liked to reach out and touch the fingertips of the other person so that he would say he could feel the pistons working through the energy in the person.
Now making big money as a movie star, Dean was suddenly able to afford the cars of his dreams. The 1950s was a golden age of the American automobile. These ultra-glamorous machines symbolized freedom and independence. But Dean wanted something faster and more agile than a big American car, something he could race. Within 17 months of moving to LA, he splashed out on a European sports car and his first Porsche, a speedster.
One night, Jimmy drove up to the house in a Porsche, which I'd never seen, never even heard of. And he said, "Come on, we'll take you for a ride." My guy said, "What is this?" He said, "It's a Porsche."
Lou Bracker met James Dean on the set of Rebel Without a Cause. They shared a love of fast cars.
I thought it was a bathtub turned upside down. That's what it looked like to me. I did, you know, never seen a car like that.
Bracker was immediately hooked and bought himself a speedster. The two friends started heading to Mulholland Drive in the Hollywood Hills to push their cars to the limit.
This was Jimmy Dean's and my private raceway. I say private because it's a public road. You have S-curves and you have hairpin curves. Mulholland is a great road race practice field. The LA Police Department doesn't think so, but Jimmy and I thought so.
Dean took his passion for speed to the racetracks of Southern California. Established drivers immediately recognized a genuine racing talent.
You've won a few races, haven't you?
Well, I showed pretty good at Palm Springs. I ran a Bakersfield.
When he sat in a machine, whether it was a Ford station wagon or the Spider, Jimmy looked like he belonged in the car.
He was so excited about and so enamored with the thought of driving in competition. That did bring him to life.
His first two outings were impressive. Dean came second and third. This is rare footage of what would be his final race at Santa Barbara.
He was a young lad, and he hadn't had any experience in race cars, but he had the desire.
But his engine blew a piston, and he ran off the track. He didn't finish the race. Not one to take losing lightly, he went after a car built to win.
Of course, he crashed like a lot of us did, but he always wanted something faster. And the faster he got, the more problems he had until he finally got in the 550 Spider.
In the 1950s, Europe led the way in race car design, and Porsche were at its cutting edge. The Spider 550 was unveiled in 1953. Made of lightweight aluminium, the design allowed the 550 to reach a top speed of 135 miles per hour, beating more powerful rivals. With the engine mounted in the middle of the chassis, the car also gave a super responsive and sensitive ride. But while the Spider's construction made it ultra-light and ultra-fast, the design also made it very fragile. Built for the racetrack rather than the road, it was intended for experienced competitive drivers. In 1955, after widespread success in Europe, just 78 cars were released for sale worldwide. The Spider quickly caught the eye of the Southern Californian racing community.
And I was racing my MG Special, and Richie Ginther was driving a 550 Spider for Johnny Von Neumann, and that thing went by me like I was tied to a post. So I says, "My God, what is that thing? I gotta have one of those."
LA car dealer Johnny Von Neumann imported 5 Spiders for competition motors.
This Porsche Spider was like a new invention, a newborn thing.
There was no faster car when it appeared on the scene. A competent driver was going to be a winner in that class.
It's like, let's get serious now. We're going to race the big boys.
Lou Bracca spotted the Spider in the window of Competition Motors. He couldn't wait to tell his friend.
And so when I got home, I called Jimmy. I said, guess what I saw in von Neumann's window? He said, what? I saw a new Spider. And he said, oh.
The next day, Dean traded in his Speedster for the brand new Spider. The price was $7,000, more than twice the average annual wage of the time. He drove straight over to Lou Bracca's.
I wanted to get in the Spider because I'd never been in a Spider. So I hopped in and we took off. The car was faster, lower, noisier, much more torque, so everything was happening quicker.
But not everyone was so excited about Dean's treasured new car.
I'm going to tell you something that's absolutely true. I was there, I heard it, I saw it. It's not something that Jimmy told me.
Dean and Bracca bumped into Sir Alec Guinness at the Villa Capri, a local Hollywood hangout.
Alec sat down and Jimmy started telling him about his Spider and then took him out to the parking lot to see the Spider. And they came back a few minutes later and Alec Guinness was visibly shaken. He was white, really. He said that he saw the car and saw a vision. He saw Jimmy dead in the car. And he was absolutely stunned. And you could tell he was stunned. And Jimmy, of course, poo-pooed it, but that is an absolutely true story.
Only 9 days after taking delivery of the Spider, Dean planned to race it 300 miles away at the Californian town of Salinas. The temporary track was set up at the local airport. But many people were concerned about his lack of experience in a car this powerful.
We all thought that it was too much car for him.
Jimmy had the means to buy a car that most people could not buy, and most people would not buy until they were a little bit more experienced.
You get out there and you go those speeds, you get into a problem. You've got to get used to speed.
Dean asked his friend Lou Bracca to join him on the trip.
And all week long he was calling me to go to Salinas with him for his road race in the Spider.
But Bracca had plans to attend a college football game.
He called me one last time from Johnny von Neumann's where they were picking up the car, putting it on the trailer, and said, we're leaving, there's your last chance, you gotta come. And I said, Jimmy, I'm going to the football game. And he said, okay, it's your funeral. That was the last time I talked to him. To this day, I'd like to believe that Jimmy never would have put that car on the ground if I'd have been with him, because he promised me he wouldn't, but I wasn't there to enforce the promise, because I really didn't want him to put the car on the ground. Just take it to the track and race it and bring it home. I thought I had persuaded him. I thought I didn't need to be there to mother him, but I did, evidently.
Lou Bracca never saw his friend again. Hollywood, 30th of September, 1955. With just 24 hours to go, James Dean prepared to set off for his first race in his new Spider. But the car still needed another 250 miles on the clock for the engine to be properly run in. Instead of transporting the Spider by trailer, he ignored his friend Lou Bracca's advice and decided to drive to the track himself. With him was mechanic Rolf Witherick, sent by Porsche from Germany to look after wealthy customers in California. At 1:30 p.m., they left Los Angeles for the racetrack, 300 miles away in Salinas, starting the journey that would end in tragedy. Fellow racer Bruce Kessler remembers the route well.
It was like being on a 20-mile straightaway. Driving to Salinas on that particular road, you could drive as fast as you wanted. You just didn't see anything. You didn't see any traffic. We didn't see any traffic.
70 miles into the journey, south of Bakersfield, Dean's new racing car attracted attention.
I noticed a race car of some type going northbound who seemed to be exceeding the speed limit. That was a nice machine he had. It was a beautiful car. It seemed like about knee-high to me. It was a very, very small, low car. Yeah, it was strictly built for speed.
Officer Hunter clocked them at 65 miles per hour in a 55 zone and gave Dean a speeding ticket.
I didn't know who he was. James Dean was the way he signed it, and I didn't know James Dean at that time. I'd never heard of him. I told him I wanted to slow down a little bit to be sure to get up there and get in the race, and if he didn't drive a little slower, he might not make it because he was going pretty fast. And apparently he didn't heed my warning too much.
At 4 p.m., they resumed their journey. With 160 miles still to go before reaching Salinas, they stopped for a break at Blackwell's Corner, a gas station on Route 466. They met Kessler, also on his way to the racetrack.
We stopped to get fuel and we stopped to get something cold to drink. It was a hot day. And while we were there, the 550 Porsche came in. Jimmy had been driving the Porsche and trying, I guess, to get some time in the car. I don't think he really had any time in the car at all.
Bruce Kessler was the last person to speak to Dean en route. They made plans to meet for dinner that night.
We arranged a place and time, and we left about probably 10 minutes before he did. That night, Jimmy never showed up. We didn't think much about it. I know he was looking forward to the race, and I know he talked about what it was like to drive this car, because it was a brand new experience, and it was a big jump.
Just days after Alec Guinness's chilling premonition about the new Spider, Dean was dead. The cars collided at a Y-shaped intersection. The Porsche landed by a barbed wire fence on the side of the road. The Ford Coupe turned anti-clockwise and slid 30 feet from the point of impact. Highway officers Ernie Tripke and Ron Nelson arrived on the scene at 6:20 p.m.
I don't think that I've ever seen one car that was demolished like James Dean's car was in any of my accidents.
It looked like it had exploded. It's a very light car made out of aluminum, and when it hit the heavier Ford, it just totally disintegrated.
My first job was try to protect the scene. I put out some flares, and as I was doing that, they were loading James Dean in the ambulance.
For the first time since the accident, Tripke and Nelson have returned to the crash site, bringing the original photographs they took at the time.
But it was a very very, very severe collision, because that spider just went all to pieces. It was just too much for it.
Dean's car traveled 45 feet after a point of impact and ended up over here next to the telephone pole. You can see that the left front of the turnip seed cart is pretty well damaged, but that was all.
It was our duty to try to determine what caused the accident and get statements from all participants in the accident. If there were any skid marks, to measure the skid marks, and if there were any pertinent items that should be photographed, namely the highway, vehicles, and so forth, we would do this.
Their photographs were crucial to the investigation. 2 weeks later, the inquest opened in Paso Robles, the closest town to the scene of the crash. Conflicting eyewitness reports left questions unanswered. How fast both cars were traveling was never clarified. 50 years on, accident investigator Mike Kennedy and his team plan to examine the crash site. They intend to use modern techniques and original evidence to solve some of the mysteries of James Dean's death. 50 years on, the true causes of James Dean's death are still open to question. Just how responsible was the rebel actor for the crash that killed him? On October 11, 1955, a coroner's inquest opened in Paso Robles, California, to determine the causes of the accident and apportion blame. The jury heard cross-examinations of eyewitnesses including Don Dooley and Highway Patrol officers Ernie Tripke and Ron Nelson, whose photographs of the scene were evidence.
Because James Dean was involved, took on a circus attitude.
Contradictory testimony confused the proceedings.
Individuals like Dooley, yes, they were eyewitnesses, but they really weren't given the credibility or allowed to tell everybody what they thought and what they saw.
Questions arose about who was to blame for the crash. Now, modern techniques not available in 1955 can solve the mystery of what caused the accident.
Straight road here and around this curve right there.
And then I'll come back up here and we'll take some shots along the curved part of the road.
Around this one that goes 41.
Yeah. Accident investigators Mike Kennedy and Mike Greenfield have come to the site of the crash. They're collecting data from the original photographs and from the site itself to discover how the crash occurred. Donald Turnipseed, the driver of the Ford, turned in front of the Porsche. At the inquest into the accident, he claimed he never saw Dean's car coming. 21st century technology can put this claim to the test and discover if there was a dip in the road that hid the Porsche from view.
So we're going to use this technology now to measure the vertical visibility obstruction to see if in fact it was enough to hide that Porsche car for a moment in time.
Kennedy's team will use a laser ranging device to help them build a 3D model of the accident scene.
We're going to measure the vertical rise and fall of this roadway and to see if it could possibly hide a vehicle for whatever time it takes to get through the dip. Okay, I am 1 foot higher than you are, so there's very little vertical distance. So far, we've taken several shots between here and 2,500 feet away, and the vertical difference is plus or minus about 1 foot. So it suggests that the dip had nothing to do with this collision.
This damages Turnipseed's claim. But while the Porsche didn't physically disappear from view, other environmental factors may have played a part. One possibility is that the low-slung silver Porsche blended into the gray asphalt.
Cars that low and silver, you don't see them. So nobody's going to be looking your sight level is above the car, really. Particularly in the 1950s with those big long hoods on cars. And there's no doubt in my mind that the man who made that left turn never saw Jimmy, ever.
Under heat conditions, there is an optical illusion that comes into play. So at a distance, sometimes it's very difficult to see the shape of a car.
The day of the crash was sunny and hot. The asphalt road surface would have given off a lot of heat.
Well, what's really surprising to me when you see him approaching is that you can only see the portions of the car that are being reflected by the sun, and the rest of the car seems to be invisible to the background. So this car is really difficult to distinguish as a Porsche, or even in fact that it's even there on the road.
Kennedy believes Dean's car would have been partially masked in the heat haze, but Turnipseed would still have had time to see the oncoming car. If he was looking where he should have been, Turnipseed would have had the chance to stop before the cars collided.
It was a Y intersection. So he takes a shallow left turn onto the next highway, and as he's doing that, his focus is changing. He's now looking down the road that he's about to be traveling on. Most likely, he's taken his eyes off the road that Dean was traveling on and approaching towards him.
This suggests Turnipseed was looking away from the oncoming traffic, in which case he was at fault.
No one knows what they're doing. Half the time you don't know what this guy's gonna do with that one.
Even though Turnipseed broke a state law by failing to yield to an oncoming car, the jury concluded he was not to blame.
If Dean hadn't died, why, it had been an automatic citation for Turnipseed for a violation of right-of-way.
Because of Dean's bad boy image, many people assume that reckless driving was the cause of the crash. One close friend still holds that view.
There was no one to blame for the death of James Dean, unless you could point a finger at Jimmy himself. That was really the only blame, and probably his obsessional need to push the envelope, as they'd say nowadays, to go beyond the limit.
At the inquest, it was suggested that Dean was driving dangerously. Witness John Robert White claimed the Porsche overtook them at high speed before crashing. He and his wife said they never saw the Porsche's brake lights come on. If true, Dean may have called on his racing experience to get out of trouble.
I think that the average driver would have hit the brakes immediately, because that was a defensive reaction. I firmly believe, because James Dean had no fear of speed, he was trying to out-accelerate and outmaneuver that Ford. James Dean was a racer.
Dean's fearless love of speed was witnessed by John Gilmore. He shared many hell-raising rides through the streets of Los Angeles with the actor.
There was a red light up ahead, and he went directly through it. It wasn't that he was going to try and beat the light, or that he didn't see the light. It was that the light was not going to stop him, and he was not going to pay attention to it. It was just this part of his personality. I was aware of it. I could feel it in his presence. It was there. It was almost like cold-blooded about it. He just drove straight ahead.
But did this belief that nothing could get in his way lead him to try and outmaneuver the oncoming Ford?
Speaking of racing, have you ever been in a drag race?
Are you kidding me?
I just thought I'd ask.
Jimmy may have thought that he was the matador and was going to sidestep a 2-ton bull.
On the track, racing drivers use this sidestep to accelerate around obstacles. 3 times Le Mans winner Hurley Haywood shows how.
I'm now going to demonstrate really a pretty simple procedure that we use in racing, and basically it's weight control, how we control the weight in the car. And we do that with our throttle.
By using the throttle to accelerate around the obstacle, the driver stays in control.
Most people are not used to balancing the car. The throttle is just there to speed the car up or slow the car down, but actually in racing we use that throttle to help the car turn through a corner.
Back at the crash site, Mike Kennedy's team prepares a 3D computerized model of the accident. The revolutionary software allows them to look at the original police photographs from a new angle and determine whether or not Dean braked or accelerated.
The photographs show exactly where the point of impact was, where the pre-skid marks were from both vehicles, and so one can work even 50 years later from those photographs and develop an understanding of how the accident happened.
The answers are locked inside these images taken by officers Tripkey and Nelson. The software will establish what happened to both cars before impact.
What I'm going to do now is transform our photo from the perspective view that the photographer had into a top-down view.
The software provides a unique vantage point of the accident.
We're trying to create the illusion that we're actually above the photograph looking down.
This overhead view of the skid marks, provided by the original photographs, reveals vital information about how both drivers reacted before the crash.
We have turnip seeds skid marks leading right up to the point of impact, which is right here. This straight line leading up to the impact point is a braking tire mark from the Porsche. So he definitely had his brakes applied at the moment of impact, and the brakes had been on at least 10 or 20 feet prior to the impact point.
As the Ford loomed over him, Dean took his foot off the accelerator and braked.
It changes direction right here at impact and arcs around as the Porsche rotated in a counterclockwise rotation right at the time of impact.
Dean reacted as any regular driver would when faced with an oncoming car. He did not attempt to outmaneuver the Ford. This leads on to one of the most hotly debated questions of all: how fast Dean was driving. The commonly held view is of a wild rebel actor dying in a high-speed collision. But is it accurate? At the inquest, the jury had to rely on inconsistent witness statements to determine the speed of the two cars.
We did not have any pure and true indication of his speed right at impact.
Police investigators had few clues to work with.
This one witness said that Dean's speed, he thought he was doing over 100 miles an hour.
Officer O.T. Hunter, who had caught Dean speeding, was a key witness at the inquest.
They wanted to know where I was when I gave him the ticket, the time I gave him the ticket, and how long it took him to get from that point to the point where the accident was.
Calculating the time it took for Dean to get from where he was stopped to the crash site, the district attorney calculated that the Porsche was traveling between 85 and 90 miles per hour. But this was far from scientific. Within 1 mile of the Y intersection, the Porsche overtook other witnesses.
Robert White and his wife that were traveling on Route 466 that maintained that Jimmy came up so quickly behind them that they didn't see him.
Because Jimmy was driving a sports car, you might say, and since he had numbers painted on him, why, I imagine everybody took for granted he was driving too fast.
How fast Dean was going has always been a matter of debate, until now. Kennedy's modern crash investigation techniques can answer that 50-year-old question. By taking into account the weight of both cars and measuring the distance they traveled from the point of impact to their final resting place, he can calculate the speed they were traveling immediately before the crash.
The speed that these vehicles were traveling at, exhibited by the way that they moved after impact, in the range of 70 to 75 miles per hour for the James Dean Porsche, 60 to 65 miles per hour on the turnip seed Ford Coupe.
Dean was driving 10 to 15 miles an hour slower than the inquest concluded, but both he and Turnipseed were well over the speed limit. Dean might well have gone on to make countless movies and win many more races if only he'd taken his own advice.
Well, Gig, I think I'd better take off.
Oh, wait a minute, Jimmy. One more question. Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine. You know?
With his computer model, Kennedy is able to show what would have happened if Dean had kept to the speed limit.
This animation is where we change the scenario and we reduce James Dean's speed from 70 to 75 miles per hour down to the speed limit of 55 miles per hour, and all other things remain the same. And as you can see, the two vehicles don't collide, and they miss each other by approximately 20 yards. And so you can see really clearly the difference it makes.
Although both cars were speeding, at the inquest neither driver was deemed responsible, even though Turnipseed crossed the path of the Porsche.
I think Jimmy was just happened to be there at the right time and was innocent, but I realized the inquest didn't spell that out.
Dean's background and reputation didn't help his case.
Had a lot of money, that bought a very expensive car, $7,000. It was a German car. It wasn't an American car. He was traveling in a community that he didn't live in. There's no question that Donald Turnipseed was favored as being the local boy, the all-American boy that was a victim.
With Dean unable to provide his defense and the mechanic unable to remember the crash, the jury exonerated Turnipseed. Despite all the findings, there remains an unresolved question, one that challenges the legend of James Dean's death itself. Was Dean behind the wheel at all? Today, Don Dooley is the last surviving crash witness. Dooley and his brother-in-law were interviewed separately by the police. Both claimed Dean wasn't driving the Porsche at all.
The one wearing the white T-shirt, he was on the left side of the car, facing us.
State-of-the-art technology will address the biggest mystery of all. Who was driving the Porsche that killed James Dean? It is part of Hollywood mythology that James Dean died behind the wheel of his racing car. But two crash witnesses insist that Dean was not driving. They also found him slumped across the passenger seat.
My brother-in-law and I had to go into the Pastor Obel's district attorney's office and give statements, and he took us in the room separately, and my brother-in-law and I compared notes afterwards, and we said everything pretty much the same. James Dean was sitting on the left side facing us, which would be the passenger side. The man wearing the plaid shirt was behind the steering wheel, and that was the mechanic.
Dean was seen behind the wheel by the officer who pulled him over for speeding. But after that, the two men made a stop and could easily have changed places. Rolf Witterick, the German Porsche mechanic, was there to look after the car. It would have been normal for him to share the driving on the long trip to Salinas. With this in mind, could the inquest have come to the wrong conclusion? Mike Kennedy is able to reconstruct the infamous crash and provide the definitive answer. By looking at the injuries sustained, Kennedy can pinpoint where the occupants of the car were sitting in relation to the point of impact.
The contact angle, as shown here in this 3D illustration, indicates that the driver of the Porsche was in direct contact with the left front corner of the Ford coupe. Fortunately for the passenger in the Porsche, he was not in the contact area.
At 16 feet long, the Ford coupe weighed twice as much as the aluminium Spider. With the engine behind the driver, the lightweight design that made the Porsche such a phenomenal race car was no match for the heavy steel Ford. The nature of the injuries and the damage to the cars show us who was actually behind the wheel.
Whoever survived was certainly not the driver, and in this case, James Dean did not survive So in fact, that makes him the driver.
While Witterick was thrown clear, Dean's broken neck and internal bleeding were consistent with him taking the full force of the impact. This pushed him into the passenger seat.
When the vehicle came to final rest, James Dean was actually sitting against the passenger door, although his feet were still contained in the driver's well.
Don Dooley still maintains that Dean was not at the wheel of the Spider when it crashed.
They said that my brother-in-law and I had untrained eyes. We didn't know what we'd seen.
Although Dooley claims he saw the mechanic driving, Kennedy can explain the inconsistency between Dooley's testimony and his own conclusions.
Typically, when someone witnesses a car accident, they do make their own interpretation of what happened. They might get a glimpse of the actual event, and then they fill in the information around that glimpse. And then their story almost always ends up being something different than other witnesses who witnessed the same event. And none of their stories will ever be consistently the same.
The things that I say truthfully out of memory, because I have nothing to gain by lying about it.
The one man who could have ended the mystery was the mechanic, Rolf Witterick. He was too badly injured to attend the inquest. He returned to Germany and never spoke about the crash. In 1981, he too died at the wheel of a car. Dean's death helped transform the promising young actor into an enduring Hollywood icon. On the 8th of October 1955, his body was laid to rest in his hometown of Fairmont, Indiana.
We got there and the church was overflowing and he couldn't get near the place.
They had speakers set up in the windows so people could hear that were outside, and it was a very, very huge event.
In the year after the crash, his fame grew dramatically, as did his fan base. His last two movies were launched to huge acclaim. 50 years on, his image is still one of the most recognized worldwide.
The way he died contributed greatly to his image, to the icon that he has become.
We still get a lot of new fans today. You know, his talents have left quite a following.
He died in a very romantic concept, and Jimmy would have liked that.
Today, there are no signs of his popularity waning. 50 years after his death, he still remains the ultimate symbol of the American rebel.